Hello there once again. Today we move on to unit number 3, corresponding, of course, with chapter 3 in our text. Our chapter has a different name, the Southern Colonies in the 17th Century. I call the unit Cavalier Society, the Development of 17th Century Virginia, which starts with Jamestown, which we'll get to presently. What does Cavalier Society mean, however? This is not a reference to the Cleveland Cavaliers, who used to be a basketball team in the NBA until LeBron James left. That's a joke. But the name does stem from the King of England's army in the English Civil War of the middle of this century right here. The major wealthy elite landowners in Virginia, who we're going to learn about here in this lecture as well, when that Civil War began, were by and large overwhelmingly supporters of the king's side in the English Civil War. In some of the other colonies that we'll visit, and some that we won't, there wasn't as much one-sided support for the king. There was often support for the other side. So Cavalier is a reference to the name for the king's army in the English Civil War, and the colonists here, at least the wealthy ones, keeping abreast of politics in their home country, England, weighed in on the side of the king. The first successful colony the English ever planted in the New World, partially in response to that huge lead that we saw Spain achieve in our last unit, the huge sprawling empire that took up already much of North and South America both, was planted at Jamestown, Virginia, by a company first known as the London Company, later renamed the Virginia Company. And it's important, I think, to point out, to begin with, as strange as this may sound, that this colonizing venture was undertaken by a private company, says Virginia Company. They were the equivalent, rough equivalent of today's, a modern corporation of today. So the King of England, in this case, a king called James I, who the King James Bible is named after, decided to sort of not have to undertake the cost himself. The English monarchy in those days, the government coffers, were not exactly sort of overflowing with gold and silver and wealth. That's not to say that the kings of England did not live lavish lifestyles. They did. But when it came to wars and foreign ventures like colonization, it was expensive. The king, his government could have afforded it, but they preferred to put it in the hands of private investors who would take all the risk, and the king could and did tax them in response. So it put all of the risks on the shoulders of the company, who then would make profits, but they'd still have to pay taxes, and did, to the royal government. So as Professor Rourke, our textbook author, says, though England thought a colony would strengthen the country, the company's investors, quote, risked their capital because they fervently hoped to reap quick profits from the colony. Maybe rich loads of gold and silver awaited discovery, as they had in New Spain. And the early colonists and the planners of this colony and the investors you see here, they really were thinking that they were going to sort of do a get-rich-quick strike like the Spanish had done after taking down the Aztec and Incan empires. So they were to be fairly quickly disabused of this notion, because there wasn't any gold and silver in the soil of Virginia. But who can fault them from our perspective today? That's the only model they had to go on. The Spanish had hit it big in the New World, and so they expected to as well. But because of that, the resource curse did not tempt them, and in some ways, it might have been better for the English that they didn't sort of get this, like hit the lottery, win the lottery, hit a jackpot, etc. So Jamestown was the first colonial settlement that succeeded anyway in the New World by the English, and the ships that sailed in 1607, after a number of months at sea, hit Chesapeake Bay, and sailed up the first river that they found, which they named the James River. And the settlement that the place that they decided to put a settlement down on an island in the river, they named Jamestown. Apparently, they were none too creative about naming things in those days, naming everything in sight after their king. The map here orients us a little bit since it shows the location of present-day Washington, D.C., and the states of Maryland and Virginia. If you're not familiar with a map or the geography of the east coast of our country, this won't help. But if you all are, this is where it's located. So it's not too far from Washington, D.C., from Richmond, Virginia, etc. At the bottom of the slide, I say English culture in the American colonies. This is something that's so obvious we can often overlook it. We are now going to switch our attention, uh, basically for good, from other European countries like Portugal and Spain to England. We'll still talk about France and the Dutch as they come up here and there. But why the English? Not because they're superior to anyone else, European or otherwise. They're not. It's because, again, as we should already know, our culture, our country today, sort of bears the marks of its English cultural inheritance, for good and bad, for good or bad. That's true. Now, in the 21st century, of course, America has a lot of other cultural influences by now as well. That's also true and well and good, but we still do have the marks of our English background. For instance, what language is the primary language in this country? English. So there's an obvious fact right there, but easily overlooked. Our political system, our legal system, our economic system all have ties to English models and the English lead in all those areas, copied by the colonists first and then the founding fathers or framers of our Constitution later on. Location, location, location in real estate is everything. The colonists thought they were putting the settlement down in a propitious location. That ended up not being true except in one sense, but that was the main thing they were concerned about. Understandably, defense against Native Americans. Unlike what we saw happen to Columbus, or not happen to Columbus, when John Smith and the other first Jamestown colonists hit the shore, they were already ducking arrows from Native Americans. The peoples here, unlike, say, the Tainos in the Caribbean, knew warfare, and they learned, through hard experience from warfare with fellow Native Americans, not to trust strangers. So when pasty-skinned Englishmen showed up they'd never seen before, they were suspicious. So the English got a fort built as quickly as possible at this spot named Jamestown. Their original orders were to sort of build a town, kind of an English-style town, but they realized, we got attacked almost right away. We got to put a fort up before we do anything else, before we get attacked again. So the fort really became the settlement of Jamestown at first. Now, the settlement then spread from there. The colony over the next decades spread to the wider Virginia colony. Maryland, was settled somewhat separately later on. So it's Jamestown for now, just a fort, then a larger settlement, and then towns built further and further out into the countryside as the English pushed back the Native Americans by force over the decades. To the original fort and settlement, a precarious existence indeed, as one of the first settlers said, night and day groaning in every corner of the fort, most pitiful to hear. That's in the spelling of the 17th century, and the syntax is somewhat 17th century as well, but you still get the point. The fort being such a priority, not only in terms of the speed with which they felt they needed to build it, and the amount of work that went into it, but it was fairly strategically located and built for warfare as well. So they did throw it up pretty quickly, but it wasn't without thought. Again, as Professor Rourke says, the men were put to work building a fort triangle-wise, with 3 bulwarks at every corner, like a half moon, where cannon were placed. After a couple weeks' hard labor, the air ringing with the sounds of felling trees, sawing of timbers, hammering of clapboards, and cursing of men suffering from blistered and bloody hands, the fort was completed. A stout palisade or curtain about 8 feet high provided sufficient protection from Indian arrows. Loopholes cut in the timbers and cannon mounted on the 3 bulwarks allowed the English to fire back safely. The fort offered a clear view of the river, built as it was on one of the island's ridges. So they did put some thought into the fort. This may have been the one thing, as we'll see, that the English colonists did well in the first, 10 years or so of this settlement's existence. There was kind of a trial and error process to develop the colony into a success. Of course, the company wanted this to be an economic success. Its investors did as well. And so to develop into that, they really had to practice trial and error methods. Since this is the first successful, there were a couple of short-lived tries, but since this colony became kind of the model for the other 12 English colonies to follow in the system that eventually we refer to as the 13 English colonies, they kind of went through some failures. So historians have kind of noted 3 different ways, 3 different methods used in succession. The cooperative model, which was the first one tried. Cooperative is a little bit misleading in this sense. It doesn't refer to the whole colony or all the people there, workers and everyone else cooperating, though of course that had to happen as well. But it's referring to the leadership. There was a council of 7 leaders. This plan was put into place by the Virginia Company itself, its leaders on the other side of the Atlantic in London, and the 7 leaders were to make decisions together by vote, and we'll see this didn't work out very well. The cooperative model was then replaced by the martial model. Martial, in this case, the word martial stems from a word relating to warfare. So like when someone declares martial law, they're declaring military law. So the martial model was kind of like the military model, with one governor top down. So now from that point forward, after the martial model is put into place, the colony, the settlement at Jamestown, is being run like a military operation. The general at the top and barking out orders to everybody else. When that didn't work, a little bit later on, now years into the project, the open society model was put into effect, which more or less relied on capitalism or free enterprise, at least kind of an early version of capitalism. We'll see these, kind of chronologically as we go through this. Among the most important of the early leaders who went on the first voyage, Bartholomew Gosnold, Christopher Newport, and Edward Wingfield, who you see here. And these 3 guys ended up being on the Council of 7. I'm sure they believed that they'd be on the Council of 7. And in this case, they all were right. But I say believe because the company did something strange. I'm not even sure why they did it, but it wasn't a good decision. They decided to not announce who the 7 council members or leaders would be, and they put it in a sealed envelope and ordered everyone not to open the sealed envelope till they were already safely ashore on the other side of the Atlantic. And they adhered to this rule. So it was only when they landed, weeks and weeks later, and opened the envelope that they knew which among them were the 7 that were supposed to make the decisions. These 3 guys assumed or thought they would be on there correctly, as it turned out, because they were important people in the project and important people already in England before they left. Bartholomew Gosnold on the left was one of the sort of early planners, kind of mastermind behind this whole project in the first place. The other 2 here, Newport and Wingfield, or gentlemen from the elite class, upper class in England, so they assumed they'd be leaders. Captain John Smith was the shocker on that list. When the envelope was opened, I forget who opened it, and the leaders were read out. Smith was the seventh name read, and it caused a stir, to put it mildly. Smith didn't come from a gentleman's upper class background. He came from a common background. He distinguished himself as a soldier in warfare. He traveled all over the world. He led a dramatic soldier's life. He was captured one time, sold into slavery, escaped. He did all these sort of daring things that would make a movie that wouldn't even seem true. Some of them were so outlandish. So he had quite a reputation by this time. Military exploits were one of the few ways in Europe in the 17th century that you could rise above the station you were born into. Otherwise, it was a pretty static, society. Not a whole lot of social mobility, but military, exploitation was one of the few ways that you could rise. So Smith had, in a sense, sort of risen to the ranks of gentlemen, but wasn't accepted by those who had been born into it. As Karen Cooperman says in her recent book, The Jamestown Project, of all the counselors, 7 leaders, Smith was the only one who did not come from a well-connected background, and he had already adopted something of an oppositional stance. He never concealed his contempt for the ineptitude and selfishness of those who were selected for leadership because of their birth and connections. Smith was obviously put in this group of leaders because of his ability and his experience, not because of his connections and because of his birth. And he knew that, they knew that, and it caused for a lot of friction and bad blood. Another way in which the decision-making of the Virginia Company was flawed from the beginning. Once Smith did assume leadership, never total leadership, but became kind of the head of the council. He wasn't at first. James Horn says he must have enjoyed being in charge. Death, disease, or disgrace had seen off his rivals on the council. Death, disease, or disgrace for all the other 6. And at the same time, his own knack for survival and undoubted achievements gave substance to his role as leader. Some might have questioned his methods in dealing with the Indians, but no one could deny his ability in a crisis or challenge his right to the presidency, his due as the only surviving member of the original council who had not yet served. So Smith kind of outlasted everybody else, though he was one of the 7 counselors, but he got his turn as president of the council once all the rest of them were gone in one of the above-mentioned manners or the other. The famous story of Smith's captivity and relationship with Pocahontas is somewhat a myth. The likely reality is quite a bit different than this. Most of us have seen the cartoon version of this, and there's a little bit of truth in it. I'm not saying there's no truth to it, but of course we don't usually expect a cartoon movie, however good in some ways, to be, historically accurate. Professor Horn, who I've already quoted, says the event would in time assume a mythic importance as a symbol of the transcendent power of love over racial hatred. What we can say with some certainty is that the ritual did not happen as he described it, meaning Smith. Pocahontas would not have acted on her own initiative to save the Englishmen. Since she was just 11 years old, such a public display of disobedience to her father would have been unthinkable. What occurred was probably a ceremony of adoption in which Smith was symbolically killed and then reborn, marking a passage from his old existence as an Englishman to his new life as an Anglo-Powhatan. Powhatan was the name of the tribe. The English named them this. The leader's name was Powhatan as well. They just sort of named the leader after the tribe, which wasn't the Native American name for the tribe. It gets complicated. So Pocahontas was the chief Powhatan's daughter, and they were members of the Powhatan tribe. Pocahontas merely played her role as instructed Horn goes on to say, very likely a far less dramatic part than Smith describes. So we don't know for sure, because the only real evidence we have on this is John Smith's own diary, it's somewhat biased and it's imperfect in many ways. But it's likely that what I just read is more along the lines of what actually happened, because of the way Native Americans tended to do things. We know there's a great deal of diversity in Native America by now, but this kind of ritual way of doing things, this particular one, was fairly common in some other Native American cultures. So, in a sense, all this was staged, and the capture, the torture of John Smith, and his eventually being let go by Pocahontas is part of that. In essence, what's being done here is sending a message, and establishing sort of a symbolic relationship between Powhatan and John Smith. So most likely, Pocahontas did not let John Smith go out of love, as we kind of see in the movie, and it's been sort of the story for a long time, but because that was her role in this already scripted drama. The message being sent that Smith probably didn't understand, and Powhatan probably assumed he'd understand. One of the many cultural misunderstandings that we're going to see, or have already seen, between Native Americans on one side and Europeans on the other, is that he was sending the message saying, you go back, I let you go. I could have killed you. I could have executed you, but I'm going to let you go. Now you go back home to your little English fort there, and you tell all your guys how benevolent and kind I was, and also that I'm the big dog here, that I rule. And next time, if I catch you, you might not be so lucky. Now, that wasn't actually said, as far as I know, but the message was implied by the fact that they tortured him and let him go. They had the power of life over, life and death over him, and didn't use it, but could have. So this appears to have been a part of a fairly common sort of cultural sort of custom when an enemy was captured in war. The colony went through all kinds of trials and tribulations from the beginning. This place was a disaster, really, for the first 10 years of the settlement here. Rourke saying it's difficult to exaggerate the fragility of the early Jamestown settlement. One historian, another historian I know, says that early Jamestown was an absolute disaster and death trap. The word death trap, I think, is sadly accurate. David Price, on a book on Jamestown, says about the infamous winter of 1609 and 1610, known as the Starving Time, which may have been the low point of the early colony's history, though it's hard to say because there's a lot of competition for that honor. But he says, now famine began to look pale and ghastly in every face, so that nothing was spared to maintain life and to do those things which seemed incredible. George Percy recalled. Percy was one of the early leaders as well, not on the council, although he thought he should have been. Under the right conditions, it was a short step from eyeing rats and mice to eyeing freshly fallen corpses. An untold number of the English fed on the meat of their dead fellows. Yes, that means what it sounds like. They were so hungry, so famished during the starving time, that cannibalism was apparently practiced. So you know that your colony is in desperate straits when it comes to feeding itself when people resort to that. That's a pretty, I think, clear sign. An untold number of the English fed. After one native was killed in an attack and buried, a group of colonists dug him up several days later and ate him. So I know that's extremely unpleasant to hear, but it does give you, I think, a good sense of the terrible conditions. So winters were harsh. They are on the East Coast anyway, even today, but they were particularly harsh in the first half of the 17th century, during what's known by scholars as the Little Ice Age. And so in the wintertime, things were particularly brutal. though they were difficult even in spring and summer as well. Those that survived the starving time into the next spring saw a new group arrive by ship, but there were only 60 left of 500. So in the previous fall and going into the winter of 1609-1610, the starving time, 500 settlers, only 60 survived. There's one time a little after this where the fort was down to, I think, 38 settlers. So again, the starving time is the most famous period of intense suffering and struggle on the part of the colonists here, but it's arguable whether it's the worst time. So the cooperative model didn't work well, partly because of bickering and arguing between and amongst the 7 leaders. We'll get into that a little bit more later on. And at one point, then the Virginia company, that is, send out a governor. Right, he's an employee of the company, but since it's a private venture in the hands of the company, not the English government, this guy Thomas Gates, known as the Ferocious Englishman, sort of set Jamestown under authoritarian rule. This is when they kind of moved from the cooperative model to the martial model, saying, well, it didn't work with 7 guys sort of sharing power and making decisions in concert. We're going to have to put power in the hands of one guy, make it a top-down system, and do it that way. The Virginia Company, according to a recent book, not just on Virginia, but on a sort of larger topic, but talking about Virginia and Jamestown here, was intended to be a money-making enterprise. And after 2 disastrous years, there was not a whiff of profit. The directors of the company decided they needed a new model of governance, replacing the ruling council with a single governor. So remember that the English king, the English government, had farmed this whole project out to a private company, and their number one goal was profit, as is usually true of companies. Now, of course, the government's reason for starting a colony was not so much profit, though that helped them too, because they can tax it. But part of this is geopolitical and strategic. They're competing against Spain and other European countries, but thought it would be best to do this kind of somewhat indirectly, put it in the hands, again, of a private company. Gates arrived, the Ferocious Englishman, and his deputy, a lawyer named Sir Thomas Dale, and they imposed, quote, a work regimen of draconian severity, meaning great severity for English settlers, though not, of course, for the elite running the colony. If the indigenous peoples could not be exploited, perhaps the colonists could. The new model of colonial development entailed the Virginia Company owning all the land. Men were housed in barracks and given company-determined rations. Work gangs were chosen, each one overseen by an agent of the company. It was close to martial law. So one of the key things to sort of take from that quote and remember is that the company owned all the land. During this phase, they're all just sort of employees. And the problem here, or at least a big problem, is one of incentive. Why should I work harder, right, if I just get the same meager wage, this week as I did last week, and I've worked twice as hard, or this month as opposed to last month? So there's not a lot of incentive for people to work very hard when the company owns everything. So we now get to what you see here, the 5 major reasons the colonists struggled to survive in the first, say, 10 years of Jamestown, roughly speaking. Then we'll move on to the 5 major explanations as to how the colony sort of turned things around and succeeded, before sort of in the last part of the lecture and unit talking about Bacon's Rebellion, the first major incident of class conflict in the English colonies. So the problem of environment, the problem of Native Americans, the problem of leadership, the problem of labor, and the problem of unrealizable goals. We'll take these on one at a time. And if I go through the trouble, as I did in the last or the first unit on Native Americans, and write down and talk about 5 major reasons for this, right, or 3 of that. This is like a neon sign saying, study me, study me. So you want to know the 5 major reasons that they struggled in Jamestown early on. So the multiple difficulties of geographic location. There's really 2 things here. One is they located the settlement, the fort, near a swamp. 2, they located it near an estuary. They were on an island in the river, but they were close to swampland, and they're really at sort of an estuary point. In the lower right, you can see photographs of the ongoing uh, archaeological digs at that site, which you guys have access to through their website, and you're doing an assignment on this. So it might be useful not only to study for the exam, but to do well on the web-based assignment, to pay attention, extra carefully in this unit and this part of the unit. So, okay, so what? They locate near swampland. How is that a big problem? Extra mosquitoes in the summertime, big deal. Well, yeah, mosquitoes are a big part of the problem. Mosquitoes can carry disease, like little things like yellow fever and malaria. So disease was spread uh, uh, to the colonists from these sort of infested swamp areas. There were lots of ways to die in early Jamestown, as we'll find out. So much so that some of the autopsies, or the equivalent of autopsies, that have been done on skeletons dug out here at the spot you see in the bottom right, or on in the fort that's been dredged up. But sometimes there's so many things sort of wrong with the skeletal remains. Like this guy could have died from this, or this. You had all those. So lots of ways to die. So locating near a swamp wasn't a good idea. Of course, nobody knew what caused diseases like malaria fever worldwide, so they couldn't know. However, John Smith, one of the early leaders we know, and the most famous of them, did note that Native Americans seemed to vacate the area in the summertime. And he thought that can't be a coincidence. We're here sort of dying during the hot, humid months when mosquitoes are all around, and they leave. So they must know something we don't. Although, of course, Native Americans didn't know what caused malaria in terms of its kind of final cause. But I think they had recognized there's something about this swamp area that is not good for health, at least during the hot months. So this wouldn't be discovered until much later, that it was the mosquitoes carrying diseases that were the problem. The second geographic issue, environmental issue, was that they located at an estuary. What is an estuary, you ask? Good question. It's not a word that comes up too much these days, but it means the point in a river at which the fresh water meets the salt water, sort of near the exit or mouth of the river. Right? Rivers empty at sea, are most of them empty at sea, and so there's a point at which the fresh water and the salt water kind of come together on an exact line. There's some mingling that goes on between the two different types of water. And an estuary, I think it's safe to say, all estuaries, I guess there could be an example I think of to the contrary, or I'm not thinking of to the contrary, but the point in the river at which the estuary is located would change throughout the year. It would sort of move up and down. Why? Well, because rivers usually originate higher up, right, and flow downhill. So when the spring melt, ice melts, snow melts, there's more volume and more water in the system, in the river, in the stream going through, and so that means a bigger, more forceful current, which would then push the salt water further back than would happen, say, in summertime, after all that spring runoff of melted snow has gone through the system. Now it slows down, maybe even to a crawl, until it goes through the process again. And the colonists had the bad luck, bad decision as it turned out, to locate themselves at the estuary point, basically in the summer months. So they were okay when the spring runoff happened, because that pushed the saltwater sort of further out, closer to sea from where they located. But in the summer, the saltwater started creeping back up and was sort of right around them. This is a problem. The fort was pretty much near the bank, one of the banks of the river. But remember, they're oftentimes at warfare with Native Americans and under siege, and surrounded. And so there were times where it wasn't safe to go out, especially when they were severely outnumbered by Native Americans. So even getting down to the river to sort of fetch water and back would have been a difficult thing to do. But let alone go away to a spring somewhere where there's not salt water, where you have fresh water, but is much further away. So there were times where the only option they had, realistically, was to dash out of the fort down to the river, grab get some buckets of water, and haul them back quickly. But this, in the summer months anyway, would be salt water. And they knew that salt water wasn't fit to drink, at least over the long term, but they were desperate at times. They surely had some stored water as well, from fresh sources when they could get out, but it, is conceivable, I think, likely that it dwindled at times when they were stuck in the fort for long periods of time. Some of the bodies or skeletons that have been researched and studied, again, the equivalent of autopsies on long dead bodies, or the remains of them, show that the amount of salt in the system was sometimes great. One body, I think, one skeleton, they found, I think, 6 times the livable amount of salt in that person's system. So they were like chugging salt water like Gatorade, apparently, and may have died from it. Though again, there might have been other things in that person's body as well, like a disease, this or that. So, but it might have been the cause of death, and maybe they know that, and I don't. Nonetheless, that's striking to find that they'd be drinking that much salt water. There's another problem with locating near an estuary, and that is if and when the river, in like the summer months, slows to a crawl. You've probably seen rivers like this before, where in that at that time of year there's barely a current at all. Sometimes the water seems to be almost stagnant and kind of swirls around and kind of meanders lazily here and there. And that's kind of what I think we're looking at here. If you can visualize it from the picture in the lower left. And there were no sewage systems at Jamestown whatsoever, so they dumped their sewage in the river. And again, not a problem in the spring months when the current is fast and swift. They dump the sewage in and it takes it basically out to sea. It's like a toilet flushing it right out to sea, but not in the summer months. And you think, well, they can't be dumb enough to dump their waste in the water right in front of them when they know it's not going very far. Well, yes and no, but they're not dumping it right in front of the fort probably. But remember, at times they're not able to get too far away from the fort because of Native American attack or fear of Native American attack. And a lot of the attacks, by the way, were certainly caused by the English and the things that they did aggressively against Native Americans. So, the Native Americans are often retaliating against the English. Nonetheless, the colonists are hard pressed to, leave the fort at all. And if they do, just get down to the bank. So sometimes it may have been no choice but to dump the waste there, nowhere else. Other times they might have just thought, well, we dumped it far enough away from the settlement, the fort, that it's not gonna come back here, not realizing again how maybe stagnant the tide or lack thereof actually was. So people are drinking water, salt water, sometimes with other things in it as well that I won't go into. I know that grosses everybody out, and it should, because we want to get a sense of how difficult this was, what explains the death trap scenario here. By the way, in England, the Virginia Company was selling this whole project, to get colonists to come over as a success, not as a death trap. So let's go back to, sorry for the dizziness here, but if you look in the the right side here, this is basically an ad, sort of offering most excellent fruits by planting in Virginia, exciting all such as will be affected to further the fame. So this is kind of like the equivalent from the 17th century of like a glossy, brochure, about some real estate opportunity, and it's got lagoons and pelicans and beautiful, sort of just here it is right here. It looks nothing like that. So of course the Virginia Company wasn't going to tell them the truth, and how much they knew of the truth was limited in those days anyway. But they knew people were dying. This colony was a disaster, but they're not going to say that. They need bodies on the ground, and this is part of how they get more and more people to come. Also keep in mind, many colonists knew that there was risk. I mean, all of them knew there was some risk, but for some, this seemed like a good opportunity, even with the risk, because there wasn't a lot of social mobility in England. So if you were a poor person, didn't own any land, and you probably never would own any land in England, even if you knew that there were real risks that you might not survive, this might seem well worth it. You think, at least I have a chance there of getting a piece of land and maybe rising, to a higher station, a class in life than I ever will here. So I'll roll the dice. And why not? Sorry about that. On to the second problem, the second explanation for their early difficulties, and that is they ran into they located next to a powerful Native American neighbor that they had to contend with, the Powhatan Indians. The English sort of simplified his name and called the chief Powhatan himself. And Powhatan, as I said before, is the father of the more famous now Pocahontas. But he certainly was an able leader and had lots of power. So as one recent book says, a coalition of some 30 polities, meaning political entities, owing allegiance to a king called Powhatan. So this really was a paramount chiefdom, something we saw in some other regions of Native America in our first unit. So he had basically like 30 different separate settlements and villages that he had largely through intimidation, but some cooperation as well, sort of brought under his own power. So the English were yet again unlucky because they could have just accidentally located in a place where there wasn't such a powerful kind of concentration of Native American power and Native American warriors. But that wasn't to be. Powhatan himself was asked to sort of come and visit the English at the Jamestown fort. And he said, "If your king have sent me presents, I am also a king, and this is my land. Your father is to come to me, not I to him, nor yet your fort, neither will I bite such a bait." Again, stilted 17th century language from our perspective. That's, of course, translated into the English at the time. But you get the point. This guy is saying, I'm not falling into that trap. You're trying to lure me into your fort so you can capture me? Hell no. But he's also saying, again, I'm the big dog here. I'm not coming to you. You can come to me. So this guy understood how the game of power was played. In Karen Cooperman's book, The Jamestown Project, she says, all the English who wrote about their experiences testified that Powhatan and most of the men and women who ruled under him were extremely impressive. William Strahan, one of the colonists, wrote of Powhatan's majesty, which oftentimes strikes awe and sufficient wonder in our people. That's an Englishman saying that my fellow English citizens here are awed and in sort of wonder at this guy's ability. And I stress that because we already know that Europeans, including the English, of course, were racist and thought that the Native Americans were inferior. But they were certainly impressed with this guy, Powhatan. English aggressiveness early on was part of the problem as well. Not that it's ever stopped, really, but it probably wasn't a good idea to ever fight wars against the native peoples here, the Powhatans or other nearby tribes, just because the English were already up against so many hardships and had so many things going against them anyway. Rourke says, Powhatan's people regarded the English with suspicion, for good reason. Although the settlers often made friendly overtures to the Indians, they did not hesitate to use their guns and swords to enforce English notions of proper Indian behavior. More than once, the Indians refused to trade their corn to the settlers, evidently hoping to starve them out. Each time, the English broke the boycott by attacking the uncooperative Indians, at least those that were uncooperative, pillaging their villages and confiscating their corn. So, John Smith, as we already noted, was a skilled, gifted leader in many ways. We'll talk about him again in a moment. But the one, I think, big criticism that is probably apt is that as a military man by trade, by profession, I think he leaned on the use of force too often. I'm not even talking about the morality of all this. We could criticize the morality of the English here, from top to bottom. But just from a strategic or practical perspective, why would you go to war with a group of people who you're relying on to feed you? You're trading your goods for their corn, and that's keeping you alive. Why would you risk that by going to war with them ever? So this was a constant problem for the English colonists at Jamestown. The problem of leadership, which brings us right back to John Smith. I put a question mark there because there's a number of possible problems here. None of it's entirely clear. You see a list in black there of the 7 initial members of the council. Right? Those are the names that were on that piece of paper when they opened the envelope, and that rather dramatic scene set up by the orders of the Virginia Company. Smith's was the last name on there. We recognize some of the other names already as well. As Horn says in his book, a president was to be elected from the 7 men. Don't think of president of the United States, that just meant like leader. Was to be elected from the 7 men named who would serve for 1 year unless removed by a majority of the council. It was expected that the president and council would reach agreement by discussion, but if it came to a vote, a simple majority would decide an issue, in which the president was granted 2 votes. Serious drawbacks to all this whole system, all too evident from the first day. The council would not permit Smith to take up his place. And what about those not named who might reasonably have expected to be appointed? I mentioned a George Percy in an earlier slide who had surely expected to be one of the leaders and was probably shocked when his name wasn't on the list. So there's lots of egos here that helps explain the conflict. But I think that the most interesting problem, and maybe the most important one, or the most severe one, was more or less between John Smith and maybe not all other members of the council, at least in time, but John Smith, the lone commoner here, and the other guys who all came from privileged elite backgrounds. All these guys came from something known as the gentry class in England. The gentry were not nobles, but they were part of the upper class. So the upper class in England was made up of the nobility, aristocrats like dukes and lords and barons, earls, and the gentry, who weren't nobility, but they were oftentimes as wealthy as the nobility, and sometimes the 2 families married together, and so they became sort of nobility. And some of them actually families, many of whom were originally gentry families, originally successful in business, became super wealthy, bought a huge estate in an area next to a bunch of dukes and other nobility, and eventually were ennobled by the king, by the English government. So the records indicate clearly that the number of these are called gentlemen, right? Gentry, gentlemen. The number of elite, rich gentlemen on there in the first years of the colony, the first ships that went over were like 6 times out of proportion to their numbers or percentage in the population of England. So they're like 2% of the population in England, the richest, the most the elite of elites, but there were over 10% of them among the first people of the colonies. This undoubtedly was because the Virginia Company was trying to get a lot of landowners there to be kind of leaders to kind of anchor the colony's success, and enough of them had signed up to go. But this becomes a problem, as we'll see in multiple ways, sort of when we get to the problem of labor. But here, so it was more than just the 6 other leaders that were gentry, Smith being the odd man out as a commoner, not born into the gentry class, because there were other guys like George Percy who weren't on the council. So there were, in a sense, too many rich, powerful guys here for this to really work. But in this, on this slide, the real problem is that the other guys looked down on John Smith, at least at first. He did make alliances with a couple of them later on, and they sort of rallied to his leadership, but some of them never did. Christopher Newport, for instance, actually had him arrested for reasons I won't go into on the ship ride over. So there was already bad blood amongst the leadership group, of course, not knowing that they were going to be, leaders together. Newport must have been maybe shocked more than anybody else when that envelope was opened and the names were read and Smith's name was on it after he'd already arrested him. He didn't know Smith was going to be a leader. And that's why at first, as I said a little while ago, that the council refused to seat John Smith at first. They refused to accept at first that he was even a leader at all. But what could they do? The company that employed them and rich and powerful guys, richer and more powerful than these guys, they were the ones who put Smith's name on the list. So in the end, they had to bow to the inevitable, but they didn't do it easily. So why would they look down on this guy, Smith, Captain John Smith, the famous guy here, when we've already noted that he was an able leader, gifted in many different ways, tons of experience overseas. He'd never started a colony before, but all of his years as a soldier, and in some ways a soldier of fortune, gave him invaluable experience dealing with other peoples, with new languages, etc., etc. And so, that reason alone, you'd think the other guys would be, feel blessed to have this guy along. But remember that the upper class in England and Europe as a whole were snobs, and birth was sort of everything to them. They didn't respect people that worked. They didn't work themselves. And Smith kind of worked his way up. They don't respect that. They respect your family name. They respect the family that you're born into. So what they're saying is, we don't respect this guy because he got to be sort of powerful here the wrong way. He worked for it. We did it the right way. We were born into it, which is, of course, backward to our way of thinking today in our present 20th century world. But that's what the rich and powerful thought at the time. I mean, that was extremely common. That was the norm. So this is, I think, the main way in which the 7-man council was dysfunctional and eventually seen not to work by the shareholders, the directors of the company back home in London. But there were other conflicts as well that I don't have time to go into that don't involve the difference between commoner on one hand and a bunch of snooty gentry on the other. The problem of labor and work, which brings us right back to the snooty gentry. Who would do the work? Apparently not gentlemen or soldiers. There were quite a few soldiers on board and in the forts in the early years, which was a good idea. But there weren't enough farmers, which was a bad idea. So the gentry should have been kind of replaced by the farmers, and the colony would have been better off. And Smith in the diary that he kept, that we still have, a primary source document, noted on a number of occasions, or displayed frustration with not being able to get work done. At times when the colony was desperate for food, for reasons partly already mentioned. He said at one point, "He who does not work shall not eat." It's pretty straightforward. He talked about men who never did know what a day's work was. He's talking about the guy on the right. And I don't know who that is, by the way. We probably know, but I don't know. But that definitely is a member of the gentry. That's how they dressed. And I like the picture just because you can picture that guy not working. You can picture that guy as a snob, thinking, John Smith, ooh, he's a low-life commoner. He became powerful by working? How disgusting. So this is one of the problems. This is part of the answering the question, who would do the work? Apparently not the overrepresented gentry that were there, right? There's more gentry by 6 times than in the larger population in England, and Smith stuck with these guys, and some of whom don't like him already. He wrote a letter to the directors of the company back in London. When you send again any more settlers, I entreat you rather to send me some 30 carpenters, husbandmen, gardeners, fishermen, blacksmith, masons, and diggers of tree roots, well provided than 1,000 such as we have. Don't send me 1,000 more gentry. Send me some people that have real skills, carpenters, gardeners, blacksmiths. That's what we need. Although it is apparent that even the soldiers didn't want to do agricultural labor. They were proud of their skills and their position, their status as soldiers, and kind of refused to work. So there were some non-gentry types that also kind of refused to work, which is part of Smith's anger and frustration as well. But it's particularly striking that there's so many gentlemen there, and that contrary to our value system today, they were. This wealthy, powerful group was proud that they didn't work for a living. They weren't supposed to work for a living. That doesn't mean they couldn't do jobs that were leadership jobs like government and church leaders, but that wasn't considered to be work in those days. Certainly not working with their hands. That would be verboten. The fifth explanation for the disastrous early years were the unrealistic goals of the Virginia Company, and the two main things that they wanted in the early settlement from their leaders and the workers there were them to dig out the precious metals like gold and silver, send it back home, and simply find a water route to Asia. Which, and I say that somewhat tongue-in-cheek, put a smiley face there, because of course those aren't simple things to do. Now we already know that there were no precious metals in the ground, or very little, but they expected, because the only model they had to go on was the Spanish, that they were going to hit it rich, strike it rich, hit it big, like the Spanish had done. And when the directors of the company, the owners of the company, kept sort of getting nothing, no profit, they assumed that the leaders like Smith and the others were not doing their jobs. They're lazy. They're incompetent. What's wrong with you guys? And there was correspondence back and forth across the Atlantic between the directors and the leaders. The leaders like Smith and Gosnold and others, Wingfield, they're like the managers. So it's the managers sort of in a squabble with the owners, back and forth. And the managers are sending letters and dispatches saying, you don't understand. This isn't as simple as you're making it sound, and those things sort of aren't easily obtainable. One colonist said there was no talk, no hope, no work, but to dig gold, refine gold, and load gold. So this was the directive, and they were sort of on a fool's errand because there wasn't any gold. But the owners weren't buying that, and the managers here only found out through trial and error themselves. What about a water route to Asia? Remember, Columbus and his initial objective was to sail west and get to Asia. So that's still a goal, even though it's fairly well known by now, again from the Spanish example, that a lot of wealth and power could be extracted from the New World. They still want to find a route to Asia. And why would they think that's so simple? Well, part of it is because of the lack of geographical knowledge that existed. Look at this map. This is a classic. Now, they didn't, I guess, make maps, standardized maps in those days, what we do today, so that north, south, east, and west weren't in the same position that they would be today. Right? Today, on all maps, north is up, south is down, west is to the left, and east is to the right. But this isn't done that way. So to make sense of this map of Virginia, quotation marks, Virginia, you'd have to sort of rotate this to the left, up and to the left. And so if you see in the circle at the top on the map, there's Sir Francis Drake. If you sort of shifted this around, Drake should be over on the left side of the screen, right? And so everything else shifts with it. Francis Drake is pictured here because and the Englishman Drake from the previous century had famously explored the west coast of what's now the U.S. And there's a bay in California named Drake's Bay, which you've probably heard of, named after him. So obviously what that map is depicting on the top there is the west coast, the California coast primarily. And so what's adjacent to it on the bottom of the map? That's the East Coast, and you can even see Chesapeake written in there, Chesapeake Bay, so that's where they were. So if you tilt this up, you can see, okay, they got one thing a little bit wrong. They knew they were the West Coast and East Coast, they got that right. They didn't accurately portray the distance between the West Coast and East Coast. So I'm not saying it's only this map that explains how easy they thought it should be to find the Pacific Ocean, but the overall thinking about or lack of understanding of the distances, I think you can see is at least one factor in explaining their confusion on all of this.